From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Fenella France, the Chief of the Preservation Research and Testing Division, and I'd like to welcome you to the 66th Topics in Preservation series. The topic today is integrating analytical tools and treatment decision-making for a 1513 hand-coloured Ptolemy Geographia Atlas. And also welcome to those of you joining us remotely today. In 2009, the Rare Book and Special Collections Division of the Library of Congress requested conservation of the Lessing J. Rosenwald copy of Ptolemy's Geographia from 1513. Secured in a binding that was not original, the atlas contained 47 woodblock and letterpress printed maps based on Ptolemy's study of world geography from the 2nd century AD, as well as European discoveries up to 1513. The complexity of the atlas's condition revealed itself quickly, resulting in the formation of a research team with a diverse range of expertise who set out to understand both how the atlas was produced and how it acquired its current condition. This research was to answer curatorial questions and to determine how it should be conserved. The team comprised curatorial staff from the Rare Books and Special Collections Division, Dan DeSimone, Conservation Division staff Sylvia Albro and John Bertonaschi, and Preservation Research and Testing Division staff Lynn Brostoff, Cindy Conley-Ryan and myself, as well as others who have been very helpful along the way. I'd also like to give a special mention to Eliza Spalding, who was very critical at the beginning of this project. So the project is currently in treatment stage, but some aspects of treatment are still being weighed. As you all know, verdigris pigment is a very tricky matter. Even though the project is in the treatment stage, it remains a collaborative project between the Conservation Division and the Preservation Research and Testing Division, as will be illustrated in the presentations. PRTD is also doing parallel work on analysis of verdigris and understanding of the ageing properties of different recipes of verdigris, and informally collaborating with two groups in Vienna, BOKU University and Austria National Library. This talk was presented at the ICOM-CC Graphic Documents Working Group Triennial Meeting in Vienna in April this year, with support of the Cress Foundation and the Carol Horton Fund. The meeting had a session devoted to verdigris research, and Lynn and Sylvia also met separately with colleagues at the Austrian National Library and BOKU University as part of our continued and ongoing collaboration in terms of verdigris degradation. We'd like to share the results of that meeting, and they'll be representing their talk and promoting further discussion. And the offline discussion will also include John Bertonaschi. So just a short introduction about the speakers. Sylvia Albro is a senior paper conservator in the Conservation Division at the Library of Congress, a position she's held since 1984. She's a graduate of the Cooperstown Graduate Program in the Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works. Dr. Lynn Brostoff is a research scientist in the Preservation Research and Testing Division at the Library of Congress. She serves as the Analytical Services Liaison and conducts research that currently focuses on corrosive media, including verdigris pigment and iron gall ink. Before coming to the library in 2008, she held positions as a scientist at the Smithsonian Institution, the National Gallery of Art, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She obtained her PhD in chemistry from the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. John Bertonaschi is a senior rare book conservator at the Library of Congress, a position he's held since 1997, following the completion of a melon conservation internship at the Folger Shakespeare Library. He earned an MFA in Book Arts from the University of Alabama in 1992 and is a member of the Guild of Bookworkers Washington chapter. So I'd like to hand over to the speakers, and I know you will enjoy the presentation today. Thank you.
Good morning. I'd like to thank some of my colleagues who have heard quite a lot of this information before for being so supportive of the project, those of you at LC, and also a special thank you to all of the interns who have worked on this project over the years, many of whom could not be here today, but we appreciate the work that you did for us. Thank you. In 2009, One of the most valuable books in the Library of Congress's collection, the 1513 Ptolemy Atlas, was brought to conservation for study. The atlas is from the Rosenwald collection of rare books in the Library of Congress. It entered LC's collections as is in 1945, a gift and favorite book of collector Lessing J. Rosenwald. It is folio size and contains 47 double-page maps along with Ptolemy's 2nd century geographic coordinates of the known world in his time and several printed letters and texts. The atlas needed attention because of the tight opening of its binding, which pinched the maps in the center, and because of the deterioration of a green color in some of the maps. Here we see how the map of the Upper Rhine River area does not open completely and displays the problematic green in the atlas and its brown offset into the reserve areas of the paper. And I'd just like to point out that this brown color here, for those of you who are not familiar with this kind of degradation, this is offset from the green of the opposite page. The design and making of the original atlas project began in 1506 in the Santier region of northeastern France by a group of humanist scholars, including the cartographer Waldseemüller, the maker of the large wall map on display in the library's Jefferson Building. The project was supported financially by the Duke of Lorraine, René II, but the atlas was not completed until 7 years later, 1513, in the city of Strasbourg, backed by a second group of investors and printed by Johannes Schott. While there are many 15th and 16th century atlases based on Ptolemy's work, the first printed one stemming from 1477, this particular edition is unique because in addition to its portrayal of maps based on Ptolemy's original work, the maps in the second half of the volume are based on information gained in European discoveries and voyages of the late 15th century and after. So in this case, we see the known coast of North Africa at the time of Ptolemy in the 2nd century, and we can see how different the information was by the 1500s on the geography of that continent. Here's a close-up of how the deteriorating green pigment was causing breaks in the center of the volume, offset of discoloration, and general weakening of the paper. And once again, here's the offset here from this green design. Important questions about the origin and authenticity of the volume have been answered for the most part by a detailed technical examination done by the research team that Fenella mentioned. The results of this study have been published and presented here and elsewhere, and so they'll only be quickly summarized here. Today's focus is instead on how analytical techniques were used to develop and monitor the conservation treatment. For those of you who are interested in the questions about how the atlas was made and more about its provenance and all of the hidden inscriptions that revealed information about this atlas, which atlas maps were authentic and which were not, please see John and me after this presentation, and we'll be glad to direct you to the publication or talk to you more about that in person. As I said, this presentation is going to focus on the treatment. So these are some of the questions that our team was charged with answering. What is the date and origin of the binding? Are all of the maps and text from the same printing and from the same source? Is the hand coloring contemporary to its printing in 1513, or is it later? And why are only 7 of the 47 maps in the volume in poor condition? And of course, the important thing for today, how can the maps in poor condition be treated to slow or stop their degradation cycles? The cover and sewing were identified as not original by the discovery of a 20th century paper used as a compensating guard in the most recent binding. We were able to identify the watermark in one of the guards using a known paper sample in the library's collection, identified as a French paper from the Arches paper mill. And this sample here comes from the Harrison Elliott collection, a collection of paper samples which we have also in the Rare Book collection, and which is very useful for this kind of thing. This little guard here is one of these little white inserts here that was a compensating guard used in the most recent binding. So we were able to save it whole, and that gave us the clue about the year of the latest binding. The presence of silking used to mend one of the maps also pointed towards a 20th century restoration and rebinding. Silking, for those of you here who are not conservators, was a technique of pasting silk on paper in deteriorated areas that was introduced in the late 19th century and used mostly in the 20th century here in the US. So the presence of this as a repair on one of the maps once again corroborated the 20th century binding. When we discovered that the binding was not original, we had the curator's permission to disbind the book. We then removed extra guards along the center that prevented the maps from fully opening and discovered that the color had been applied to the maps before the papers were folded for any binding. Evidence of 3 previous bindings was detected, proving that the color application was quite old. The palette is consistent throughout the map with the exception of 2 maps. And as I say, details about all of these connoisseurship issues are published elsewhere, and we'd be happy to talk about them at another time. Within the atlas, we found that only 7 maps were in poor condition, while most of the maps were in reasonably good to excellent condition. On the right is shown a map in poor condition, where the green has turned brown, the paper has darkened, and is quite soft. Analytical tools helped us to determine that the green pigment used throughout the volume was the same in maps both in good and poor condition. X-ray fluorescence characterized the green color as containing copper, lead, and a small amount of chlorine. Polarized light microscopy identified the green from a good map as verdigris. That both greens, good and bad, were the same was evident even in the case of a single map, where green in both the bright and brown forms was present. The bright green was only revealed after the stiff guards that had been added for the last binding and that prevented the map from being opened were removed. In trying to figure out why the same green color had aged differently in the different maps, we discovered a whitish deposit on some of the poor condition maps. Under examination with UV fluorescence, all of the maps in poor condition revealed that a substance had been clearly brushed on the back of the paper, and sometimes on both sides. This substance was not present in the maps in good condition. So this is just a detail of the back of this particular map, and it shows here the brush stroke of the material, and the maps were also very fluorescent. Fourier transform infrared analysis of the white powder on the surface revealed that it contained gelatin and potassium aluminum sulfate. Examination of the papers used in the volume revealed 3 different kinds. The elemental profile of the papers was quite different for each, especially in their calcium to iron ratio. So we can see here the 3 papers side by side. The crown watermark paper with its very even manufacture. Here you see a fleur-de-lis watermark paper, slightly different mold, and a third paper, an unwatermarked laid paper, quite different in profile than either of the other 2. The best quality papers in the volume had the crown watermark and showed very even sheet formation and pulp preparation. The laid lines were also 33 millimeters apart, so quite widely spaced apart. And you can see how white this map is. The papers with the lily watermark were second best, but here's one that was treated with the alum gelatin compound. The green turned brown, and the paper is tan colored. And the formation of this sheet is quite different than the crown. You can see it's less even, and the clumping along the chain lines is less regular, and there are also lots of inclusions in the paper. The third paper, and the most deteriorated one, was the unwatermarked type that had been brushed out with the alum solution. So here's a comparison of the unwatermarked sheet on the right with the good quality paper on the left. And there's a remarkable difference in how the green color has aged on both of these sheets. Another copy of the same 1513 atlas in the library's collection, but without any color, showed the same brown discoloration of the unwatermarked paper, even without pigment deterioration or alum restoration treatment. The availability of this volume in the Geography and Map Division in an original binding was of great use for comparison in our analysis of the elemental profiles of the papers. We think that those maps that had turned brown with natural aging in our volume were targeted about 100 years ago for treatment with the alum solution, and that treatment subsequently accelerated the deterioration of the pigment as well as the paper. We actually looked at 6 copies of this atlas in various collections and online, and there is remarkable consistency with the same types of paper with the same watermarks used for printing the same maps. So in other words, the same maps are deteriorated in the same volumes. The untreated crown paper, shown as the blue part of the graph, contained the highest amounts of calcium and much lower quantities of iron. The copper in this paper was limited to the color areas only. So just draw your attention here to the fact that the calcium-iron ratio in the crown paper was 17:1, whereas the calcium to iron ratio in the unwatermarked paper was only 5:1. And all conservators know that calcium is good for paper, but this is really a dramatic proof. The alum-treated papers that are shown in red here were mostly unwatermarked papers, and these show increased quantities of sulfur, potassium, iron, and copper throughout the paper. 10 spots on each paper were measured with the XRF. And in the alum-treated maps, the copper had also spread throughout the paper in a quantity that caused further deterioration of the sheet and the pigments. So I think that's pretty clear here. The double lines are the multiple measures that we made, and there clearly is a very different profile between the two papers. At this point, the following treatment plan was formulated for the atlas. First, we removed any guards or repairs that prevented the maps from fully opening. We wanted to reduce the excess alum sizing in the treated papers. Next, the verdigris pigment deterioration needed to be halted, which induced further paper degradation. After that, the unwatermarked papers were to be treated with an alkaline agent, and finally, the atlas would be rebound in a historically sympathetic and functional binding. And right now, we're still working on step 2. We removed all the added guards and repairs that prevented the maps from opening. That took quite a long time, and we have a whole box full of them. We tried to save them whole to see if we could find any other watermarks, but so far, only that skinny little one has revealed information. So we are working on the step of reducing the alum sizing in the maps, and we've treated 4 maps so far. So now I'm going to introduce Lynn, who's going to talk about how we did that. Thank you.
Good morning. This part of the talk will focus on the actual analytical results that we've obtained. And as you see in the picture, this has been a continuing collaborative process. And those pictures really represent, I think, a lot of time that was spent in the lab together doing XRF and discussing the results as we were working, which was a lot of fun. And it really turned out that XRF just turned out to be a really wonderful analytical tool for helping develop the treatment methodology, as Sylvia has introduced. So I thought I would just quickly show the instrument that we use here at the library is a Brooker handheld XRF. Normally we worked with 15 kilovolts, 55 microamps, and a titanium filter. Sylvia already showed this slide, and I was going to go in a little more detail, although Sylvia, I think you went through it pretty thoroughly, so I don't really need to. Just to reiterate that the elemental profile between maps in good condition and bad condition was clearly, like, you don't have to know anything about XRF to see that there's this big difference, especially in terms of the potassium and sulfur, which we quickly figured out was probably potassium alum and verified with the infrared spectroscopy. But then it became clear that we could monitor the treatments by looking at these potassium and sulfur peaks, as well as the copper peaks. So it occurred to me that it would be valuable not just to do the analysis qualitatively, which is what we normally do with XRF, to say, yes, this element's there, no, it's not there, we don't think, but to try and quantify the results, which is difficult to do if you don't have substrates that are very equal in the kind of scattering they have present to the instrument. Fortunately, when we're dealing with paper, we have that situation because paper presents very similar kind of scattering to the X-ray beam in XRF. So there are many reasons why you might want to go to the trouble of doing quantitative XRF. I've listed a few here. First of all, you can determine what your limit of detection is. So you can say, well, below this peak, I don't know if it's present. Okay, you can say I can determine that, maybe as low as 180 parts per million of copper, which was what we determined. But if there's less than that amount, I can't tell you. So that's an important thing to know when you're doing this analysis. Another thing is, I think we've already shown that it can give you a lot of information about the condition. And as I hope to show, you can use the information quantitatively for treatment monitoring. And I think this is a very important point, that if you want to compare your results to external studies, you need to have some idea of the level of elements you're talking about. And one of the things that we also found out was if your instrument breaks and you have to get it fixed, you can't just compare two spectra and overlay them and look at the size of the peaks, because that can change if you change your X-ray tube. So having those numbers, even if they have, let's say, a 20% leeway, which I think we had, will help you to compare throughout your study and to other studies. So we did go to the trouble of doing quantitative calibration so that we could understand the XRF spectra in terms of the amounts of elements that are there. And the method that we first came up with was pretty simple. Some of you may have seen this presented at AIC, but I'll quickly summarize it since it's important to understand before we go forward. So what we did was we took a bunch of Wattman filter papers and doped them with solutions of copper sulfate, iron sulfate, different solutions, and then I took those and had them verified and validated in terms of how much of the elements were in there by ICP-MS, which is inductively coupled plasma mass spectroscopy. So then I was able to do the XRF measurements on those and correlate the size of the peaks to the known quantities, and that's what a calibration curve is. And I used two different methods for processing that information, which consisted of either defining a region of interest, and then basically that's your peak, and then integrating the area under the peak, or using a program that Brooker gives to you, but is a little bit of a black box. So I found that it was very important to actually develop the calibrations myself in Excel, so I knew what was going on in the shape, what the shape of the curves looked like. And this is what they look like for iron and copper. And in fact, I was very happy to see very linear curves, which makes life a lot simpler when you're trying to calibrate. I did limit the total concentration on the y-axis, and if you have a wide range of your element, you may see that curve start it'll actually curve. It won't be a straight line anymore. It's possible. So you simplify things by limiting your range to that which you will find naturally in the objects you're studying. So that makes a lot of sense. So that's what I did here, and I also included reference samples that we made that contained more than one element to check whether there would be interferences from multiple elements in the paper. And there's a little bit of scatter that you see on those lines, for example, around here and especially up here. And this has not so much to do with the instrument measuring precision, but rather with the fact that the samples that we made had some inhomogeneity to them. So we could improve our technique by making better samples, which we would like to do. But for now, that's what we're using, and this also shows the calcium and potassium curves. So these 4 curves were the most interesting. You can see here there's quite a bit of scatter that could be improved here. So basically we come up with these equations, and then we use the equations to look at the peak area for on the objects that we're analyzing, and then we can relate it to the specific concentration from these equations, from these curves. So as I mentioned, one of the reasons that you might want to do quantitative XRF is to relate to external studies. So there's a very well-known study that was done here at the Library of Congress by Chandru Shahani, which many of you may be familiar with, looking at the effect of copper on the accelerated degradation of paper. So I actually took his results in his paper and plotted them out here. This plot is actually not in his paper. But you can see that with increasing amounts of copper, you get an accelerated rate of degradation here, measured as the number of folds or the increasing embrittlement of the paper. So if we actually take the results from the Ptolemy maps and we overlay them with the actual papers that Shahani used in his study, which we still have, and we got out of boxes and measured, which was very convenient, we can see here in the upper one, now we're looking just at the paper, not at the verdigris, okay, because you remember there was that copper peak that was coming up in the unwatermarked papers, so that's what we're seeing here. And we see that, in fact, here that we have, these are Shahani papers that are represented here, and here in green is the unwatermarked paper, and it's above, it's greater than these Shahani papers, which are around 400 ppm, and in fact show in his study that there was already a dramatic effect on the degradation of paper. So now, if I had only been doing qualitative XRF and we saw that copper peak, conservators could say to me, well, is that significant? Like, do we care? Is that a lot of copper in the paper, or is it a little? And we can say, yes, that's a lot. And we can relate this to Shahani's study, which is very nice. And now if we look at the offset areas, which are represented here and here, 2 different offset areas, we can see that we're really in a region of very accelerated paper degradation, which we know empirically, but here we've shown it and related it to the quantitative XRF results. So as Sylvia mentioned, based on all of this work that we had already done, we thought that a very important first treatment step was to get rid of that alum that seemed to have a direct cause and effect in terms of having accelerated more degradation in the paper, including by just spreading the copper when he brushed this stuff, she brushed this stuff on. So we had taken, Sylvia and John had removed a lot of these reinforcing guards, and we thought, well, we'll just try out some different treatment methods on the guards that already had a lot of alum in them. And here you can see XRF results from looking just at the guard. In red shows before treatment, and then blue and green show after either blotter washing with 50/50 water ethanol or straight water washing. And in both cases, it looks like the potassium is gone. So it looks like, oh, well, great, we can use 50/50 water ethanol, which would be better for the colorants in the map. However, when this was tried on the actual object, you may not be surprised to know that sometimes your pre-tests don't always predict exactly what's going to happen in treatment. And in fact, when we look at the levels of potassium before and after the first treatment, which was this blotter washing with 50/50 ethanol water, and the solution, the water portion of the solution was adjusted with calcium hydroxide, we were quite disappointed to see that we did not get that much alum out. So you can see it's, about a 30% reduction in the alum, which we thought was really not sufficient. And we also knew from the good Crown papers what the level we were looking for, which would be the natural level in the paper that had not been associated with deterioration of the green. So that was disappointing. So then we thought, well, now the treatment has to be adjusted to do a better job of removing that alum. So therefore, Sylvia and John developed some alternate washing methods. And you can see here we have treatment 2, 3, 4, and here's treatment 2, 3, and 4. And you can compare the potassium before treatment, and really, it was not until treatment 3 that it was down to a reasonable level. And this is actually this pretty good level here. And what was very surprising was it seemed like the pH was actually crucial in getting that alum out. And that was a surprise. But it allowed us in further treatments to say, okay, we can skip right to that step. You can also notice that there's really been very little change in the copper. Has this copper increased? It's still within the margin of error, which is rather large, so we can't say that that's significant at all. The iron has not changed at all in any of these treatments. And again, this is the paper, not in any of the pigment areas. And the last step, which included the calcium bicarbonate, allowed the pH to go up and the calcium to be boosted a bit. So that was a desirable step. So we also monitored treatment in the offset, which is something that would like to be targeted as a local treatment in order to reduce the copper and the staining visually. And different treatments were tried, and the 4 treatments are shown here. And here are the XRF results shown in the table. And here's a before in one of the spots, and here different 2, 3, 4. 2 is actually using a combination of calcium phytate and sodium borohydride. And I think in terms of the alum coming out, that has nothing to do with the calcium phytate, that has to do with the washing method. Really, I should have circled here the copper because we were interested in reducing the copper, and the results actually look better than expected. However, I do think that they're a little bit deceptive because these spots here where Sylvia and John had applied the phytate were very small, and it was very difficult to get the XRF there, and I think that it was diluted by plain paper. So I think that these numbers are lower than they should be. So we're going to retry this, although at least from the literature, the phytate is not expected to be a very effective treatment. However, when EDTA and sodium borohydride were tried, especially here in this area and also over here in these margins, the copper was like, it just really got the copper out. It was kind of amazing. And that was very good. And visually, the bleaching helped a lot, and I think it was also desirable, Sylvia tells me, to remove the metals before you do sodium borohydride treatment because, according to the literature, you need to do that. So this is just a before and after of this one map that ended up a little bit of as a guinea pig. And I apologize that on the left is a raking shot, but that was the best color rendition. But it was pretty good. We were pretty happy with this result, except after we looked in UV, we were disturbed to see fluorescence in all the areas where the EDTA had been applied. And we were quite surprised by that because according to literature, we hadn't really predicted that that would happen. So we did a bunch of tests. We did mock-ups using the same Shahani papers that I mentioned before that were doped with copper, and actually have been kind of naturally aged for a while now. And Sylvia and John applied the EDTA and the borohydride separately and together in a series of things. And I'm not going to step through this because it would take too long, but just to say that according to the test, that EDTA should have washed out. And we tried different pHs. We tried a lot of this, and so something different is going on in the object than is predicted from the mock-up tests. So again, these mock-up tests don't always predict exactly what's going to happen, and which is more rationale even for using a tool such as XRF that can allow you to monitor the treatment if you're lucky enough to be able to monitor with something like potassium sulfur that you can see. And unfortunately, with EDTA, we need UV rather than XRF, but here UV turns out to be the good method for monitoring this treatment. So we have not finished developing the treatment protocol. We use the UV imaging as well as the XRF to pretty much decide that the first step was going to be the blotter washing with 8.5 pH calcium hydroxide. And we're still trying to figure out what really will be the best treatment in terms of the offset local treatment and stabilization of the verdigris, but we know that we'll want to do some deacidification at the end, as Sylvia has mentioned, and we hope that in the further discussion that we can get some feedback on our thinking of what will go on in these stages. And just to show that some of the other maps have started their treatment in the initial steps, because we don't have to necessarily do all 4 steps in succession. We could treat all the maps by the first step and show the results where we've skipped over the treatment steps of blotter washing that didn't work very well and have a very satisfactory result on this map in terms of the alum reduction and what does not appear to be significant spreading of copper from the treatment that's been done. And we would like to show the Ptolemy team, which as we fondly always say has been really wonderful working group and remains a wonderful working group and a great collaboration. And we have many people to thank. Especially the Crest Foundation, Carolyn Horton Fund, who made our trip to Vienna possible. And that trip was really great because we were able to talk with colleagues who are very seriously looking into verdigris treatment. And those face-to-face discussions were very valuable. You accomplish much more than you can do by email, we find. So that was a very valuable trip. And thank you for your attention. We would like to take questions for about 15 minutes before we have further discussion. Yes?
Can you guys look into altering the conductivity of your solutions to reduce the alum?
You mean in the washing?
Yes, yeah.
So I think you used deionized water that was doped with calcium hydroxide, right? So when you say alter the conductivity, you mean reducing the ions or increasing the ions?
Increasing the ions to reduce the alum. I was reading recently that increasing the conductivity can be
There's the common ion effect. No, we didn't.
Well, I mean, I think the addition of the hydroxide I don't know if it was clear, but if the water was not at pH 8.5, we couldn't get rid of the maximum amount that we wanted to get rid of. So in a sense, we were putting more ions in the water. The 50-50, which of course had a lower pH, was not as effective, and it only took 30% out, so that corroborates what you're saying. Yeah.
But we didn't try potassium hydroxide, for example, to see if that would somehow help. We didn't think of that, but we know we want to get calcium in there in the end. One of the problems is that you really remove a lot of the calcium during these treatments, and so you do have to put it back. So we liked having the calcium in those, you know, so we didn't think of using, I don't know. Thanks.
Can you clarify between the treatments 1 and 2, one was mentioned as calcium bicarbonate aqueous, and the other was calcium bicarbonate. Are we talking about a dilution there? Or
Yeah, sorry, yeah. We did, for each of the treatments, we did at least 5 changes of the blotter. And we started, after the first test with the 50-50, which wasn't as successful as we had anticipated, we actually found that working with 100% aqueous solutions was a little bit less aggressive on the pigments. And we did at least 5 changes of blotters. We started with humidification in Gore-Tex, and then we did blotter washing off the section table, changed the blotter, went to the section table for rinsing and doing subsequent treatments. And obviously, we're not going to leave the paper in this state without doing a follow-up antioxidant treatment to address the green. You wouldn't want to just wash the verdigris and then even just deacidification, as we'll talk about a little bit later in our discussion, has not proven to be sufficient to halt verdigris progression of deterioration in paper. So we undertook these steps always with the idea in mind that we were going to use an antioxidant treatment because in recent years there's really been a lot of proof that they're effective at halting copper degradation of paper. And as I said, we'll review some of what we learned in Vienna. That was one of the main reasons we wanted to go to Vienna, is that we've been working with these partners at National Library who've invested a lot of resources into treating this problem. And we've been partners in sending them samples and doing some analysis for them. And they have devoted a lot of time and people to this problem. And we really wanted to go see their samples in person and talk to them in person and see their lab in person. And they had come here, 3 times? Members of their scientific and conservation staff had come here and shared their results with us. And so we really wanted to go there and be part of this discussion. So.
But Nora, I think also, just to be clear, that we rejected step 2 there, right? Because it was not enough by itself. So we had, that's what, you know, I know you said that.
Oh, and I'm sorry, the calcium
That's why it's on there
bicarbonate was
twice.
always in solution, in the blotter.
Yeah, so that got, number 2 got eliminated there, yeah. Eric?
In the fluorescence that you were seeing, you said, I think, that the Shahani paper you found conditions that were similar to your treatments where you didn't see fluorescence. Were there different metal concentrations in the Shahani papers than what you found in
So we chose 2 that we thought best represented, right, so 410 ppm is very close to what we were seeing in some of our papers, and then we just did one that was like way more, that would be like the offset. So this would be, this level of copper would be similar to what we were seeing in the offset areas that we were treating with the ETTA.
There were other metals in the map as well. Does Shahani only have copper? Or do you have
These papers just have copper, yes. So we did not look at specifically at whether the problem was brought about by the iron, or is that what you were getting at? Yeah. There's a little bit of iron in these papers. I analyzed these papers a while ago. I'm trying to remember how much iron is in there, but there's some. I mean, there's always, even in Wattman filter paper, right, there's a little bit of iron. But I don't remember exactly how much, and it might actually be similar, but not sure.
Yeah, I was just wondering
Yeah.
if it's complexing some other metal that's more well bound to the paper, and that's why it's sticking around.
Yeah, I know it.
It may be, although the region that the EDTA, the pH region that the EDTA is effective, works for both iron and copper. I mean, it's not the peak pH for iron, but we didn't use the
correct.
peak pH for copper either because that would be too high. So we picked a medium level of pH that we thought
Right.
was safer for the
Yeah.
paper. So according to the literature, it's supposed to be very effective. And we could actually look at our XRF results of how much iron was left in the paper in those areas too. I
Yeah,
think we
yeah.
have that.
Yeah.
But we were
it was about
hoping that some of the
700 ppm,
scientists
yeah.
in Vienna would help us with this issue, but we didn't get any brilliant ideas, but we have a lot of
No.
people here and maybe we can get some here. So
Yeah.
that's helpful to hear that
Yeah.
perspective, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a pH factor there. So I forgot about that. That it was the pH was adjusted to go after the copper. That's right. But these mock-ups included different pHs. So, but if you have more ideas, we're happy to.
We're open ears.
Jeanette.
I'm just going to ask if they're all soluble in your aqueous solutions, were you able then to wash those fluorescent spots out of the maps just using your high pH?
No, that's
So
what
That's the problem.
That's what that was the problem is it was
So
left
these
in the
res-
maps
okay,
and
so
they
these-
tried to get it out. They couldn't.
So these results from the Shahani papers, they wash out? is that
Yeah.
what you're
Right.
saying? Okay,
Yeah.
now
But
I
not from the
understand.
actual maps, even though we tried to do the same things that are done in the mock-ups here. So,
Yasmin, you had a question?
Was gelatin, were the maps, were the gelatin size, the ones that you did the EDTA on? And was all the gelatin washed out? Could this have anything to do, I mean, a lot of the EDTA studies don't deal with gelatin's paper size with gelatin.
Well, what we think is that when the alum wash for the 20th century treatment that was given, the alum wash was put on as part of a gelatin sizing.
And I meant the EDTA treatment afterwards that led
In
to
the offset
fluorescence.
areas.
Could the gelatin be implicated in that?
here's my gut reaction to it because I think it's a really good question. But there were the XRF results in those offset areas. We had kind of a big reduction of elements there. It was almost like the paper is so degraded that it's become really porous. So my feeling is that there's like no sizing left there. I mean, where it's degraded, it's really bad, and it was easily you could start. You know, your treatment solutions were in a way more effective in those areas than the rest of the paper. Certainly, you know, and in terms of the Shahani papers that we used to test here, I believe that they are sized. Cindy,
But not with gelatin. They're a
Not with
modern paper.
gelatin.
they are a modern paper,
Yeah. They're a modern paper.
but I'm sure they have some
They have
sizing.
they have a sizing, but I don't think it's gelatin. We should look that up.
Because gelatin fluoresces under UV, gelatin size papers fluoresce, and when the gelatin size is removed, they become darker gray.
Right, but
Well, we have to say that before we applied the EDTA, one of the tools that we were using was also UV fluorescence examination of the maps and all the blotters. That's why we kept washing until 5 blotters, because we were still seeing a lot of this fluorescent material come out with our treatment. So after the last blotter, then the map was no longer fluorescent. But then when we added the EDTA, it was like, wow, really fluorescent.
yeah.
So that doesn't mean that it couldn't be combining with something like gelatin, and maybe we should look into that.
Yeah.
But I don't think that it's from, I think that we have to keep in mind that the whole map had this stuff on it, and then after washing, it seemed to be gone.
Yeah, let's just show again. So this
And
is after
those
a lot of
areas,
treatment, right?
those areas are just offset areas. That's all we treated. But It's pretty bright there. Susan?
What was the pH of the EDTA?
Let me see. Let me get
So
my.
it's
I
moderate, but-
think it was 7.
Oh,
A lot of figures to keep in mind. No, I'm sorry. 8. pH 8, adjusted with ammonium hydroxide.
I also wanted to ask.
0.1 molar solution. And that's the one, that's what was advised actually in Helen Burgess's literature on using EDTA and also sodium borohydride for this kind of treatment. And she gives the curves that show you the optimum pHs for chelating different metals. And so we picked a pH that was in between iron and copper optimum pHs.
I also wanted to ask you, what antioxidants are you considering using?
Should we save that for the discussion?
Well, no, we can
Yeah.
say we're going to talk about that a little bit more with the Austrians group, and also John is going to mention some other research done in that area. But we are considering tetrabutyl ammonium bromide, and we're also considering benzotriazole. We're considering it, but TBAB and imidazolium have both given very good results with certain people's research, but TBAB is kind of the common popular one, and that was introduced by Jana Kolar of Slovenia now, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, as a possible treatment for other transition metals than iron that seemed to be covered well with the phytate treatment. But there were these other metals like copper that were not addressed with phytate. And so her research was, how do we find a material that can address the reactions that are caused by excess copper in the paper? So it's her articles that were the foundation of a lot of people's subsequent practical research. Eric?
You consider doing just fluorescence spectroscopy on those spots and then looking in the literature to see if you can figure out if you can tell what's compound.
Yeah, we talked about that. Just we at the moment don't have the manpower to sit there and develop that, because it would be a little bit of method development and figuring out so we thought about it, but truthfully I'm still uncomfortable with using the fiber optic on a work of art with the fluorescence spectroscopy, and from people I've talked to, that's I don't want to cause yeah I mean that it's using light that is potentially destructive.
But we are making a lot of historic samples, and so we could try it out on those.
Yeah. But we don't, we only have the problem complex, if it is a complex, it's not washing out, we assume it is, that on the object. So he's saying, to use like the fiber optic and, get a spectrum and then try and match it to other things. So the matching might not be trivial, so no, we haven't done that, but it's a good idea. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Elmer Huseman, Chief of Conservation Division for about 2 hours now, about 3 months now. I just want to thank the speakers and all the researchers who did this wonderful work. So one more round of applause, that'd be great. I think it's a really wonderful example how both divisions are working on something really complex and really come up with great results. I also want to thank Mark for giving us the opportunity to continue to do this. I think it is really important. We are one of the few institutions that can actually do this, so it's really great.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.